All right, let's jump right in here for today. Hope everyone's doing well and we're we've got to push through here and try to finish up our discussion of Machiavelli today so that we're on track to finish our last text next week, which is Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan. So please be attentive to the readings laid out on the syllabus, the chapters of Leviathan that I have asked you to read. Got a lot to cover today with Machiavelli. So okay, let me just take Anna. You've got a question.
Yes, after class, would it be possible for me to speak to you? Just about, I had a couple questions, but I don't want to take up too much time now.
Sure. Yep, we can absolutely do that.
Okay, perfect.
Just chime in there at the end, and we'll stay back and talk.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Okay. So let me pull up my PowerPoint and let's jump back into where we were. Okay. All right. So where we had left off was just kind of talking about the various differentiations that Machiavelli makes between different kinds of principalities according to crucial variables or factors that he thinks makes a big difference in terms of how you need to rule that territory, or the pieces of advice that he would give depending on the kind of history of that territory, the past forms of rule in that territory, and also, crucially, the questions of how you came to acquire that territory. Are you like acquiring that from another prince? Are you um, annexing territory that was a republic previously and making it into part of your principality? Did you acquire the territory through good luck, or did you acquire it through great skill of your own? Did you acquire it through wicked actions? These are all variables that he thinks matters because he feels that if you all of these things make a difference in terms of how you need to rule. If you acquired territory with great luck, that means you're going to have to you acquired with great ease. Luck handed it to you. But at that point, you need to exercise immense virtue, Machiavelli's sense of virtue, or political's kind of skill and acumen and strength. Notice, let me pause here to just say, notice that the translator of the text translates the word virtue into a lot of different words because it's a complex concept for Machiavelli, and it has a connotation of lots of different things in different places. So sometimes he translates it as skill, sometimes he translates it as strength, different kinds of words like this. Sometimes he translates it as manliness, and that we're going to talk about the kind of gendered quality of it um, later today as well. So the translator translates the word into different English words, but he always leaves the word virtue in square brackets in the text. So uh, that's just something to keep in mind, that you can see where he's translating the word virtue into different uh, corresponding words. So his Machiavelli argues that if you acquired the territory with great virtue, that means you didn't have luck on your side. That probably means you acquired it with great effort and lots of work and difficulty because you had to use lots of skill and strength to get there. But after that, it will be much easier to maintain. So again, there's different kinds of advice based on different circumstances and different histories of the territory. Now, where Machiavelli really spends the most time is in chapter 7, and that is the category of principalities acquired with good luck, especially. And part of the reason why we think Machiavelli focused on this is because that was in many ways the most relevant circumstances to the Medici, who he's writing this text for and dedicating it to. So he wants to spend a lot of time on this, and he ends up also bringing out one of his key exemplary figures in chapter 7, somebody who Machiavelli had observed firsthand, somebody who we talked about last class, and that is the figure of Cesare Borgia. And Borgia is somebody who he's a kind of contemporary, and he's somebody who people reading this text would have been quite familiar with. People reading the text at the time would have been quite familiar with. And he is somebody who Machiavelli thinks is the person to emulate when it comes to doing what you need to do to secure rule that you have gained through good luck. And Borgia was somebody who acquired his rule because of the good luck of his father. And furthermore, Machiavelli makes clear that in fact Borgia loses his territory and kind of his reign kind of falls apart because of very bad luck. So fortune is or luck is really against Borgia or in the end, and is for Borgia earlier on. So he's contending with the forces of luck or fortune. But in between that good luck he had and the bad luck he had that ended his rule, and he exercises great skill and immense political virtue. Sorry, John, I'm going to have to keep pushing ahead here. I've got to keep going. So Borgia is a figure who exemplifies skillful or virtuous, in Machiavelli's peculiar sense of virtue, virtuous action. And so he holds up Borgia and he says, this is the person to emulate in these kinds of relevant circumstances. So he says on page 519 of the textbook, in chapter 7, Cesare Borgia, who was called Duke Valentino by the common people, acquired his state thanks to the good fortune of his father, and when that came to an end, he lost it. This despite the fact he used every technique and did all the things a prudent and skillful man ought to do to entrench himself in those territories that the arms and fortune of others had acquired for him. He goes on to say, so if we look at the things Borgia did, we will see he had laid solid foundations for future power. I do not think it irrelevant to discuss his policies, because I cannot think of any better example I could offer a new ruler than that of his actions. And if his strategy did not lead to success, that was not his fault. His failure was due to extraordinary and exceptional hostility on the part of fortune. Now, I talked last class about the fact that for Machiavelli, virtue or political skill and strength is always in a battle, in a competition with fortune. And you get that sense here where he's kind of personifying fortune. And he says, his failure, Borgia's failure, was due to extraordinary and exceptional hostility. So hostility as if, Fortune is a person, hostility on the part of Fortune. So he says Borgia did everything right, but he had bad luck. And what are some of the things he does right? He goes through and describes a number of these in the chapter, and he summarizes them at the end of the chapter. So let me go to page 522 and what he says about Borgia to conclude. He says, so I have surveyed all the actions of the Duke. I still cannot find anything to criticize. It seems to me I have been right to present him as an example to be imitated by all those who come to power through good luck and thanks to someone else's military might. He goes on to say, so anyone who decides that the policy to follow when one has newly acquired power is to, and these are the list of policies and traits that Borgia had right. He says, to destroy one's enemies, to secure some allies, to win wars, whether by force or by fraud, to make oneself both loved and feared by one's subjects, to make one's soldiers loyal and respectful, to wipe out those who can or would want to hurt one, to innovate, replacing old institutions with new practices, to be both harsh and generous, magnanimous and open-handed, to disband disloyal troops and form new armies, to build alliances with other powers. So kings and princes either have to win your favor or else think twice before going against your wishes. Anyone who thinks in these terms cannot hope to find in the recent past a better model to imitate than Cesare Borgia. So this is a list of a lot of different pieces of advice that Machiavelli gives throughout this text. And many of them crystallize here in the figure of Borgia. Borgia did all these things that Machiavelli, either previously in this text or going forward in this text, Machiavelli will discuss as being important things to do as a ruler. And Borgia did all of these things. Now, again, he suffered bad luck and he ended up not having power for very long. And so, ultimately he wasn't the most successful of people in terms of longevity, but in terms of the traits that he exhibited and the judgment he exhibited, Machiavelli wants to hold him up as an exemplar. Sorry, I should have advanced here to the next slide. So that's Borgia in chapter 7. Now, what's interesting is Agathocles, the character that comes out in chapter 8. And Agathocles, he says, is someone who acquired power through wicked actions. And there's a puzzle that many scholars and readers of this text have puzzled over for a very long time about what the differences are between Borgia and Agathocles, because a lot of the things Borgia did, he describes Borgia doing, could very easily be considered wicked in the very same ways that Machiavelli describes in relation to somebody like Agathocles in chapter 8. So we've got to keep in mind what the differences are. And that we'll try to bring that out through a discussion of some different examples here that he uses about from each of their lives. So Agathocles, he says, is somebody who rose to power, came from nothing, rags to riches kind of story. He rises up through the military ranks. He becomes a powerful figure. And he, at a certain point, hatches a kind of plot or scheme where he gathers together all of the powerful people who are his competitors kind of in the territory that he's in, and he pretends to gather them together for a meeting of some kind. And at his signal, he has them all killed. He's got people around in this meeting who end up killing all of these elites. And this ends up securing Agathocles' power, and Agathocles holds on to power for a great deal of time, and he ends up being a very long-standing prince or ruler. And so he ends up actually having a great deal of like success, political success in lots of ways. So this is the story he tells about Agathocles. But he says this is wickedness. He came to power through wickedness. Now, contrast, let me go back now to Borgia. Contrast this with the story he tells about Borgia in chapter 7. What he says about Borgia, he tells this one story at one point where he says Borgia was ruling this territory and it was crime ridden, it was disorderly, it was chaotic. And he sees what he needs to do. And he hires basically this kind of tyrannical figure who is known for his violence and ruthlessness, named Ramiro d'Orco. And he knew what Ramiro d'Orco would do. And Ramiro d'Orco, he gives him power, he installs him as kind of the kind of gives him kind of power over this territory and gives him free reign. And Ramiro d'Orco does all kinds of awful things to subdue the population and bring order. But the people start to really hate and resent Ramiro d'Orco for all these evil actions that he does. And when that starts to happen, Borgia realizes that Ramiro d'Orco has fulfilled his purpose. And what he does is that he swoops in and he has Ramiro d'Orco killed and his body laid out in the public square, cut in half with a bloody knife beside it. And so he describes this gruesome scene that was all orchestrated by Borgia, where Ramiro d'Orco did all of these awful things to the people to bring order to the place. And he then has Ramiro d'Orco killed, and this makes him seem, even though he was behind the whole thing, Borgia was, it makes him seem like he's the vindicator of the people, where he kind of says, oh, well, all of these awful actions were because of this awful person who was ruling you, and I have now had him killed, and I've had his body kind of laid out in front of all of you to show you that justice was kind of done. And he, in doing so, wins the favor of the people. Machiavelli says, this is on page 521 of the textbook, this ferocious sight of d'Orco's body being laid out in two pieces with a chopping board and a bloody knife beside it. He says, this ferocious sight made the people of the Romagna simultaneously happy and dumbfounded. So they're left kind of in awe of their ruler. They're happy and they're dumbfounded. They're kind of like, think about the word like being in awe of something. You're kind of think it's beautiful, but it's also kind of terrifying, kind of elicits some fear. So that's where the people are left with Borgia. And this is part of how he he wins over the loyalty of the people. So this is the story he tells about Borgia. And so it's so again, lots of people have thought and debated here. What's Machiavelli doing in separating out the actions of Borgia as being very skillful, and somehow with Agathocles saying that those are wicked actions, and kind of creating a separate category for that, even though it seems like he is advocating in lots of places for wicked actions, for a ruler to take wicked actions. And he usually talks about that as skillful, as virtue, political virtue. So it's kind of a puzzle. And if we go back to chapter 8 and back to his discussion of Agathocles, maybe we can start to piece together one possibility here for what's going on. So notice what he says about Agathocles after he has described the way that Agathocles slaughtered all of these people who he brought together under the false pretenses of this meeting, and the way he secured power, which he held on to for quite some time. Notice what Machiavelli says on page 523 here after he talks about Agathocles. After he tells the story of Agathocles, he says, "One ought not, of course, to call it virtue to massacre one's fellow citizens, to betray one's friends, to break one's word, to be without mercy and without religion. By such means, one can acquire power, but not glory. If one considers the manly qualities, the virtue Agathocles demonstrated in braving and facing down danger, and the strength of character he showed in surviving and overcoming adversity, then there seems to be no reason why he should be judged less admirable than any of the finest generals. But on the other hand, his inhuman cruelty, brutality, and his innumerable wicked actions mean it would be wrong to praise him as one of the finest of men." Okay, so Machiavelli has said here, it would be wrong to call Agathocles one of the finest of men, even though he did all these things very correctly, and as a military general, he acted really very admirably and should be held up with any example of strong, virtuous action. But Machiavelli has said here, one should not call it virtue to massacre one's citizens, to betray one's friends, to break one's word, to be without mercy and without religion. But again, what's interesting here is that Machiavelli, throughout this text, in various places, does exactly that. He advocates for people to break their word, to be without mercy, to be without religion, to betray one's friends. He, in different places, advocates for these things depending on the circumstances, and calls it skillfulness. So there's a bit of a kind of puzzle here as to what he's up to. Now, on one hand, he may well be just kind of appeasing the censors, so to speak. You know, his arguments could already be taken as very blasphemous, the things the things he's been arguing for. Um, and in a religious sense or in a moral sense, more generally in relation to the morality and the kind of strictures of the time. But and so maybe here he's just kind of like covering his ass, so to speak. He's kind of saying, "Oh, of course, I wouldn't call that virtue," just to provide himself some cover in the fact that he is, in much of the text, calling that thing cover. So that's one possibility, but there's also another kind of way of reading what he just read, what he just said, which is he says, "You should not call it virtue to massacre one's citizens, betray one's friends, break one's word, or be without mercy and without religion. By such means, one can acquire power, but not glory." Now we have a strategic point being made here. Because for Machiavelli, the ultimate goal, really, of a prince, of a political ruler, is the first goal is power. You can't achieve anything without power. But the highest of rulers, the best of rulers, and the highest goal for a ruler, beyond simply securing power, is to achieve glory. Glory is to be remembered by your people, by your subjects, through history, by historians, to be remembered as a great leader. That's how you kind of achieve immortality as a political leader, as a prince. And so Machiavelli says here, through these wicked actions, you can achieve power, but not glory. And now this adds kind of a new element, because now if we think back to Borgia, what did Borgia do? Borgia had somebody else do his major dirty work. And he, even though he was responsible for it ultimately, he had somebody else do it who he could scapegoat and therefore maintain and enhance even the love that his subjects had for him. And therefore, Borgia was setting himself up for achieving glory, not just power, but glory. And that is something, because Agathocles did all of his cruelty out in the open, he did not set himself up for glory, only power, which he held quite successfully, but he did not set himself to be up to be remembered as and to be glorified as the greatest of leaders. So there's a few contrasts here that we're kind of unpacking. One is virtue versus wickedness. What's going on here? Why is Machiavelli making this distinction when a lot of what he calls wickedness in this chapter, chapter 8, he in other places calls virtue and says is necessary. So there's a kind of tensions to be muddled through here in terms of what's really going on with his distinction between virtue and wickedness in these two chapters. Again, not really, there's not a single answer to this, but just a tension to be grappled with. The second, thing to be grappled with is the difference between glory and power. That glory is the highest type of goal for the ruler, but power is the minimum first goal. Like it's the precondition for anything else that a ruler does. So power is needed first, but glory is the ultimate goal for a prince. And so if you can achieve power and glory, that is best of all. But if you need to do, if you're going to do so, you may well need to hide or disguise some of your more evil actions. The last kind of distinction here that comes out in this section of the text is a very famous distinction by the end of chapter 8, or in the end of chapter 8, between cruelty well used and cruelty abused. Now, he's talking about Agathocles in this context. Chapter 8 is almost entirely focused on Agathocles. And it's all about using wicked actions to come to power. And of course, as we've just seen, he spends a bunch of time saying, Agathocles used wickedness, and that means he should not be praised as the finest of rulers, and because we shouldn't call that virtue. So from that initial starting point, you might think that if he is making a distinction between well-used cruelty, using cruelty well, or using violence well, and abusing violence, abusing cruelty, in other words, overusing cruelty or violence, you might think that what he's going to say is that Agathocles abused cruelty. That seems to resonate with what he was saying in the early part of this chapter, that Agathocles used too much wickedness and therefore, he abused cruelty, he abused his violence. But that's not what Machiavelli ends up doing. By the end of chapter 8, what Machiavelli says is Agathocles used cruelty well. He is an exemplary figure for using cruelty well. So again, he's right back to praising Agathocles, which maybe again lends some credence to the kind of interpretation of this, that Machiavelli is being coy here. He's kind of covering his tracks a little bit by kind of saying, "Oh, I'm not praising this," but he does then kind of go back to praising it pretty quickly, where he says Agathocles used cruelty well, as presumably did Borgia. He doesn't mention Borgia here, but they both seem to be people who use cruelty well. And what does he mean by this? Well, he says people who use cruelty or violence well, it's not about limiting their use of violence. It's about how they use their violence. So he says people who use cruelty well, they figure out all the kind of evil, cruel actions they need to do, and they do them up front. They do them with a very heavy hand early on, and they make sure that it's all done so that they bring order to the situation. And so that is cruelty well used, is calculating all the cruelty and violence you need to do and trying to do it up front in a very heavy-handed way that sets the tone, that creates order out of chaos, and puts an end to the spiral of violence because you secure your power through the immense display of violence. That, he says, was what Agathocles did well. He used cruelty well in this way. He used immense violence to secure his power and to bring order to the chaos, and then he was able to rule successfully for some time. On the other hand, however, cruelty abused is not, he does not mean using excessive cruelty. What he means is cruelty abused is when you actually don't use enough cruelty and violence. It's when you try to play the nice guy or try to not use much violence. and um, you try to limit your violence, and therefore you don't put a stop to other people's violence. You allow the disorder to continue because people aren't afraid of you. They don't stop doing their own violence. You don't establish order and rule. So in that case, other people will continue to use violence, and violence will continue to spiral. And so in that case, you're abusing cruelty, he says. So let me just kind of go to the text and how he makes this distinction. This is on page 524 of the textbook, close to the end of chapter 8. He says, I think here we have to distinguish between cruelty well used and cruelty abused. Well used cruelty, if one can speak well of evil, he says in brackets, one may call those atrocities that are committed at a stroke in order to secure one's power and are then not repeated. Rather, every effort is made to ensure one's subjects benefit in the long run. An abuse of cruelty one may call those policies that, even if in the beginning they involve little bloodshed, lead to more rather than less as time goes by. Those who use cruelty well may indeed find both God and their subjects are prepared to let bygones be bygones, as was the case with Agathocles. Those who abuse it cannot hope to retain power indefinitely. So the conclusion is, he concludes, he says, so the conclusion is, if you take control of a state, you should make a list of all the crimes you have to commit and do them all at once. That way, you will not have to commit new atrocities every day, and you will be able, by not repeating your evil deeds, to reassure your subjects and to win their support by treating them well. He who acts otherwise, either out of squeamishness or out of bad judgment, has to hold a bloody knife in his hand all the time. Has to hold a bloody knife in his hand all the time. Whereas if you use cruelty well, up front, calculate everything, do the atrocities up front, and then you don't have to carry a bloody knife in your hand all the time because you've established order and peace. So this is where where Machiavelli talks about this famous distinction between cruelty well used and cruelty abused. And again, it's important not to get confused here that Agathocles is a figure who he says uses cruelty well. He doesn't abuse cruelty. He uses cruelty well by doing it up front and then not having to keep committing atrocities. And he kind of is able to win over his subjects and kind of at least keep them in line, even though, again, there's a puzzle here. He has already said earlier in the chapter, Agathocles didn't quite set himself up for glory. So again, there's puzzles here about how to interpret the difference between Borgia and Agathocles as exemplary figures here. So these are some of the key themes that I wanted to bring out from the first half of the text, or so the first 14 chapters. Those are all the main themes that I want to bring out from the first half of the text. But now let me turn to the arguments we want to bring out from the second half of the text or so. And this is the part of the text where Machiavelli goes beyond just kind of offering different pieces of advice and kind of talking about some of these key distinctions that he's been making and kind of honing the judgment of princes. And here he, especially in chapters 15 and 16, 17, 18, is where Machiavelli starts to wade into some important theoretical terrain. And especially for our purposes, the important questions about the relationship between morality and politics. Remember, though those are our themes that we want to keep coming back to in this first half of the course. How do our different thinkers that we're reading think about the relationship between morality and politics? And Machiavelli here will offer his very distinctive and, in fact, quite infamous take on these questions or on this relationship between morality and politics. And it's one of the things that Machiavelli is best known for. And it comes out in these chapters, chapter 15, 16, 17, 18, especially, maybe 19 as well. The 15 to 19 is where the heart of his argument about the relationship between morality and politics. So let me start to unpack some of these arguments. So one theme I want to bring out from chapter 15 is the theme of realism, Machiavelli's realism over idealism. And Machiavelli can be thought of, many of you will have heard about, especially in international relations theory, for those that have taken courses in international relations, you will have heard about the concept of realism. And realism tends to be the idea that politics is about a struggle for power, and that morality really has very little to do with it. It's about power and self-interest, and it's not about there being objective moral rules that human beings need to stay within, but rather everything is a kind of struggle for power. And realists also tend to think that your judgment gets clouded if you think too much about what ought to be. You think about morality or other normative questions. Instead, you have to take things as they are. You have to take the world as it is and operate from there with a very realistic, rather than idealistic approach to the world, and you bring that to bear on your political judgments. And Machiavelli is kind of an important figure in this realist tradition, and that's in fact what he's one of the things he's best known for. So let's notice what he says in chapter 15, where he starts to make this argument. He kind of takes a step back from the kind of in the weeds arguments he's been making to this point in the text about giving lots of different advice to princes. And here at this point, he kind of stops and he takes stock of this kind of broader theoretical question. He says, okay, our next task here is to think about the behavior of a prince, how the ruler policies and principles that a ruler ought to follow in dealing with his subjects or with his friends. And he goes on to say, lots of people have talked about this already, but he says, I hope to say something different on this topic. So he's signaling that he's kind of going to say something kind of radical or make a kind of break with what other people have said on this topic. He says, my hope is to write a book that will be useful, at least to those who read it intelligently. And so I thought it sensible to go straight to a discussion of how things are in real life and not waste time with a discussion of an imaginary world. For many authors have constructed imaginary republics and principalities that have never existed in practice and never could. So notice here what he's saying. And he's directly thinking about people like Plato. Machiavelli is thinking about people like Plato and Aristotle and lots of others in various kind of political traditions before him, whether it's the ancient Greek tradition of thinking about politics or the classical Roman writers or the Christian writers. All of these different political theorists, these major traditions that have come before him, Machiavelli basically thinks all of them have been consumed with trying to reconcile morality and politics. In other words, all of the key major thinkers of politics before him have tended to, most if not all, have tended to try to make their arguments in a way that reconciles the fact that you can be moral and be successful in politics. And so the advice that they give to political rulers is couched in such a way that says, oh, this is what you need to be successful in politics, and it also is the moral thing to do. So it ties politics to morality, or it keeps, maybe stated differently, it keeps politics within the framework of a broader morality and makes the advised political actions to still carry the kind of weight of morality. What Machiavelli says here, and his great break that he's very well known for, perhaps this text is we continue to read this text today, maybe primarily because of this historical break that Machiavelli is willing to make here, that so many others before him were not willing to say out loud. And he says that here, he says, I have chosen to write about the way things are, not about in real life, not about an imaginary world. And notice he's thinking about people like Plato constructing their ideal. He says they've all imagined imaginary republics where they think about the perfect society. He says, I'm not going to do that. He says, for the gap between how people actually behave and how they ought to behave is so great that anyone who ignores everyday reality in order to live up to an ideal will soon discover he has been taught how to destroy himself, not how to preserve himself. For anyone who wants to act the part of a good man in all circumstances will bring about his own ruin. For those he has to deal with will not all be good. So it is necessary for a ruler, if he wants to hold on to power, to learn how not to be good, and to know when it is and when it is not necessary to use this knowledge. So this is Machiavelli articulating his realism over the idealistic thinkers of the past. That realism involves a few points. One is to his claim that we need to deal with politics as it is, with circumstances as they are, and with human beings as they are, rather than with ideals. You have to not confuse the way you want things to be, the way you think things ought to be, with the way things actually are. You need to proceed from a sober understanding of the way things actually are, because people don't act according to ideals. People are not always good, and if you act like they're going to be good, you will go astray. You will be taught how to ruin yourself, he says. Furthermore, Machiavelli here makes his famous break with traditional morality. You can't all he is one of the first figures, and what he's best known for is his willingness to say that you can't always be moral and still be successful in politics. Like I said, most other people in previous kind of political traditions before Machiavelli would usually try to claim that there is a way that you can be moral and be successful and do what you need to do in politics. And their advice for political figures was still moral advice. Machiavelli here dispenses with that. And he makes this radical break and he says, you can't always be good. You can't always be moral and do what you need to do to be successful in politics. So here, conventional ideas of moral virtue are pitted against Machiavelli's idea of of virtue, political virtue. So Machiavelli is saying here to be politically virtuous, to have political skill and strength, you have to be willing to go against moral virtue. Moral virtue gets in the way of political virtue or political success. So he says, so it is necessary for a ruler, I've already read this, but just to reiterate, so it is necessary for a ruler, if he wants to hold on to power, to learn how not to be good, and to know when it is and when it is not necessary to use this knowledge. Another argument along these lines that comes out in these chapters, including in this same chapter, chapter 15, it also comes out a lot in chapter 18, is his argument about appearances, reputation, and outcomes in politics as being more important than your actual character traits, especially your moral traits. What he says is, and I see that I'm due for a break, so I'll pause here just after this point. What he says here is that in politics, people don't people judge you from a distance. People don't really know what you're actually like, so it doesn't really matter what you are actually like. Again, think about Borgia. He did all these evil things, but he covered them up by blaming them on Ramiro d'Orco, who he hired knowing what he would do. And so what's more important is about appearances and reputation. And even more important than reputation and appearances is like, what do you achieve? What outcomes do you arrive at? What outcomes do you achieve? These are the things that are most important in politics: results and how people perceive you, perception. So results and perception are much more important than your actual character. He says, forget your actual character. That doesn't matter. I mean, he doesn't quite say it like that. He actually says it a bit more carefully. He says, if you can be of good character, do it. If you can be successful and do what you need to do in politics to be successful and also be good, have good character, do it. But always be prepared whenever necessary, whenever circumstances require it. You need to be able to go from good to evil, to do whatever's necessary to secure your power, regardless of whether those things are evil or not. So you have to achieve the results. And along the way, it's important to pay attention to your reputation and how you appear to people. So do things that, make people think that you're a good person, you're magnanimous, you're generous, you're loyal. Do things that make people think that and make big shows out of those things. But behind the scenes, don't worry about being ruthless and being cruel and being evil if you need to be. Okay, let's take our break now. We'll come back to these arguments after our kind of 10-minute break. So it's 1:27. Let's try to resume at around 1:37. Okay, so see you in 10 minutes. Okay, so coming back to our discussion, let me pull this back up. Okay, so we were talking about the fact that Machiavelli in these chapters is making this argument that uh, appearances and reputation and the outcomes that you achieve, all of these are more important than your actual character. And in particular, he talks about moral traits and he says it's important to try to cultivate a reputation for being moral, but you can't always be moral. And so he talks about one place that he talks about this is in chapter 18. He's talking about a variety of kind of moral traits like keeping your word and being kind of religious. And he says, so this is on page 539 of our textbook. He says, so a ruler need not have all the positive qualities I listed earlier, but he must seem to have them. Indeed, I would go so far as to say that if you have them and never make any exceptions, then you will suffer for it. While if you merely appear to have them, they will benefit you. So you should seem to be compassionate, trustworthy, sympathetic, honest, religious, and indeed be all of these things. But at the same time, you should be constantly prepared so that if these become liabilities, you are trained and ready to become their opposites. You need to understand this. A ruler, and particularly a ruler who is new to power, cannot conform to all those rules that men who are thought good are expected to respect, for he is often obliged, in order to hold on to power, to break his word, to be uncharitable, to be inhumane, and irreligious. So he must be mentally prepared to act as circumstances and changes in fortune require. As I have said, he should do what is right if he can, but he must be prepared to do wrong if necessary. So here again, he's reiterating this point that he's been making, not only about your appearances and reputation, but about your relationship to morality more generally. That you should appear to be charitable and humane and trustworthy and sympathetic and religious, but you need to be prepared to not do those things as required. So the appearance of them is more important than the actual practice of these things. You and he says you should do what is right if you can, but as soon as that goes against your interests of your power, you need to be prepared to be evil, to do wicked things or bad things or evil things. 6 point I want to bring out here is also a discussion that in from chapter 18. And that is his discussion about and it goes along with everything we've been saying, but it's a very famous kind of metaphor here from the text that it's worth highlighting. What Machiavelli says is that there are different ways of fighting, whether it's in politics or military conflict or what have you, different ways of engaging in conflict with your competitors. And he says there are two first, like the first distinction is between human ways of fighting and animal ways of fighting. And he says human beings, distinctly among other animals, can and often does like set rules and fights within the rules. So that you can set kind of principles or rules of conduct and stay within those, whether they're laws or moral principles or what have you. And so he says it's distinctly human to be able to set rules and fight within a set of parameters or rules. Whereas animals fight no holds barred, he said. They fight without rules, without limits. They fight to the death. And so he says these are two ways of fighting. And he says a prince needs to know both of these. A prince needs to know, and again, this goes along with what we've been talking about. He says, be moral if you can. He says, you need to be able to know when to fight within the rules, within the law, or within the moral frameworks of prevailing frameworks of the time. You need to know when to fight within the rules and when to fight without rules, without limitations, in an animalistic way. So there's a human way of fighting within rules, and then there's an animal way of fighting. And he says, if you think about the animal way of fighting, there are two animals to emulate if you're fighting without rules. That is the fox and the lion. And the fox and the lion are different because the lion is very powerful and strong. It's kind of brute strength and induces fear into others. Whereas a fox is like wily and like agile and kind of outsmarts and outmaneuvers its competitors. So he says the lion on this page 538, the lion does not know how to avoid traps, and the fox is easily overpowered by wolves. So you must be a fox when it comes to suspecting a trap, and a lion when it comes to making the wolves turn tail. Those who simply act like a lion all the time do not understand their business. So here he's making a point that often people think in politics you have to act with just, it's all about brute strength and power. But he says, no, that's not always the case. Again, that's maybe like Agathocles acting with brute strength, but you sometimes have to be nimble and subtle and concealed in your actions. You need to outmaneuver and avoid the traps, and you have to use cunning. That's the fox. So again, there's like three ways of fighting. There's being human and fighting within the legal and moral parameters that are laid out. Then there's the fox way of fighting, where you're wily and you don't fight within rules, but you outmaneuver and outsmart your competitors. And then there's the lion way, which is you again not fighting within the rules, within any rules, but like fighting through brute strength and fear. These are different aspects of how you need to know how to act as a prince. Another theme that is important for us to bring out here, and this is, I'm going in a different order here. This actually comes out in chapter 17, is the relationship between fear, love, and hatred in politics. And what Machiavelli says here is that, it is best in politics, and we heard him say this about Borgia, when he praised Borgia, one of the things he said was Borgia was both feared and loved by his subjects. Again, that was part of what killing Ramiro d'Orco did in the way that he did. That's part of what it achieved, is it achieved Borgia being both loved and feared by his subjects. And so what Machiavelli says is that so often in politics, you need to choose. If you don't have to choose, you should try to be both loved and feared. It's best to be both loved and feared, where people always fear you, but they also adore you. They love you and they feel loyal towards you. They feel affection towards you. Um, that is a nice supplement to being feared. But he says when you need to choose, you should always choose being feared. Should always choose being feared rather than being loved when you can't, when you have to choose between the two, when it's a judgment call of doing something that'll make you feared versus something that'll um, make you loved or affect the love that people have for you. You have to fault on the side of being feared. And the reason he says this is because he says fear is kind of a more predictable, reliable emotion. It's a more durable instinct in human beings. Human beings, if you threaten them, their bodily well-being, their comfort, their well-being, or those of the ones they love, they will be afraid and they will act out of that fear and tend to obey. And so it's a reliable fear is a reliable emotion. Tends to be the highest motivating factor and impulse in human beings. Whereas love is a little bit more secondary. Love people give to you when it suits them. So he says, as a ruler, you can kind of control other people's fear, but you can't control their love. Love is somebody that somebody gives kind of it's their own choice whether to give. They're in control of it. Whereas from the outside, you can control their fear because fear is a very reliable and predictable kind of emotion. And so he says you should always rely on fear because love people will take away as soon as it doesn't suit them anymore. They're in control of their own love, whereas you on the outside can control them through fear. And so fear is more important than love, but ideally you would combine the two and find a way to both be loved and feared. Now, what he also says here is that nevertheless, in your attempt to be both loved and feared, or to just be feared, or what have you, you need to make sure not to become hated. Because hatred is an especially dangerous emotion for Machiavelli. Hatred, when people become consumed by hate for you, it's the one thing that actually can cause people to overcome their own fear and their own priority on their own bodily well-being. If they come to hate you, they may well be willing to risk their own safety and their own life in order to get vengeance upon you and to act out on their hatred. In other words, hatred gets people to lose their minds, their rational interest. And so, what Machiavelli says is you have to avoid being hated, cultivating contempt or hatred in your subjects or in the people around you, your neighbors or competitors or what have you. So hatred, he says, you avoid it by a couple of main things. When it comes to your subjects, he says, just try to stay away as much as possible from people's families, their women and children, he says, or their like property. because those are the main sources of their hatred. If you come for their property or their families, their loved ones, that's when you will develop their hatred. So you should try to stay away from those things as much as you can. And in particular, he says, actually, their property matters more because people will be madder about their property, that you taking their property than you harming their father. He says, like, that's their property is like the kind of most important thing. But nonetheless, he says hatred is to be avoided by trying to steer away from the things that will elicit people's hatred. In relation to kind of international affairs and your neighbors and such, he says you avoid being hated by um, being like a firm friend or a firm enemy, like getting people's respect by um, standing for something and sticking to it, not being, he says, you are despised when you are like fickle and you are indecisive and you are, and he actually, again, and we'll talk about the gendered aspect here. He says, if you're effeminate, so he denigrates the kind of feminine. He says if you're effeminate, if you're indecisive, if you're like not loyal to your friends and you don't stand up as a good ally, if you try to be too neutral, you will be despised because nobody will respect you then. So he says avoid being hated by avoiding these things. Yes, John, you have a question.
Yes. Won't cruelty and wicked acts lead to you being hated?
Again, that is the risk, and that's why they have to be done carefully. So, and that's partially why it's important to conceal them when you can, to pin those actions on other people. So you have to try to make sure that your violence and cruelty has a point and it achieves some important outcome. And as much as possible, if you can hide it when necessary, that's kind of important too. So all of these things are important because yes, cruelty, violence, they are potentially going to create, they can potentially create hatred. So you should always make sure that your violence has like a point and achieve something rather than doing it willy-nilly and without a purpose. And that's so again, it's a fine line, but yes, you run the risk certainly of generating hatred when you do cruelty, especially in particular ways. So that's why part of why he gives all this advice about how you need to use your cruelty. Okay, so these are a number of the themes that we want to bring out from especially the key chapters from 15 to 19 is where a lot of these kind of arguments come out, and I would say is kind of the heart of the text in many ways, especially for our purposes in thinking about the relationship between morality and politics and Machiavelli's argument on those themes. Now, let me go to the last set of themes that I want to bring out. And this actually comes out close to the end of the whole text in the very famous chapter 25, which is the second to last chapter of the text. And it is here that Machiavelli finally crystallizes something that's been in the background and that we've been alluding to throughout. And that is the battle between the prince and his virtue, the princely virtue that Machiavelli has been trying to advocate for and to teach throughout this text, and the main competitor of the prince and his virtue, and that is fortune. So fortune is like luck. It is this, all the changing circumstances of the world, anything that's outside of your control. That's all the realm of luck and circumstance, fortune. And in this, in Machiavelli's worldview, this is the great battle. You're trying to put your imprint on the world. You're trying to use strong, skillful, virtuous action and judgment in the world, and to try to impose that on the world while staying one step ahead of fortune, trying to outwit and outdo the changing circumstances that you can never fully control and are always a very serious competitor and threat to your power. And this is a gendered battle. It is one in which Machiavelli talks about virtue as a kind of manliness. And the translator actually translates virtue as manliness in lots of ways, because it has, for Machiavelli, this kind of gendered, masculine kind of trait to it and connotation to it. And so it's in chapter 25 that this battle that he's been alluding to between virtue and fortune comes out most explicitly. So one of the things he says here in chapter 25 is that really there's like a battle between free will and circumstances, that there's like the things that are beyond your control and there is your free will. And he says these two things are kind of in a battle with one another. You're trying to impose your will on the world, but there's always all kinds of fluid, changing circumstances outside of your will and control. And what he says is basically that fortune and circumstance is about half. It controls about half of what happens. And that leaves human beings with a control over about half. And in particular, as a prince, you can control you can control about half, and fortune controls about half. And you're in this kind of half and half battle where you're trying to outdo fortune. But you can still try to prepare for fortune. You can try to have foresight and planning and predict where circumstances are going to lead. And those who are able to do that tend to have more success in terms of exercising their will and putting their imprint on the world and using their skill and virtue. So fortune controls about half, and we can control about half through our bold actions in the world. He says on page 550, he says, he's talking here about the fact that sometimes it feels like what's the point of any of this, of, political life or trying to exert your free will on the world, because it feels like, oh, everything's so out of your control. Circumstances are so much changing all the time. Sometimes it can feel quite disheartening and like, what's the point in trying to exert your will in the world? And Machiavelli says, I've even felt like that. But he says here, nevertheless, since our free will must not be eliminated, I think it may be true that fortune determines one half of our actions. But that even so, notice the gendered, she leaves us to control the other half, or thereabouts. So fortune, who he personifies as kind of like in the kind of spirituality of the time, there was thought of as like kind of a goddess of fortune, a goddess of Fortuna, and she controls about half, while we control the other half. And he then kind of uses one of the first of his important metaphors in this chapter. He talks about the prince needing to have foresight and planning and adaptability to stay ahead of fortune. And he says, fortune is like a river. So the river analogy or metaphor is an important one here. He says, and I compare fortune to one of those torrential rivers that when they get angry, break their banks, knock down trees and buildings, strip the soil from one place and deposit it somewhere else. Everyone flees before them. Everyone gives way in the face of their onrush. Nobody can resist them at any point. But although they are so powerful, this does not mean men, when the waters recede, cannot make repairs and build banks and barriers, so that if the waters rise again, either they will be safely kept within the sluices, or at least their onrush will not be so unregulated and destructive. The same thing happens with fortune. So fortune is like a torrential river, an overflowing river, or a river that can potentially overflow at any time. And you can use foresight and planning, and you can put things in place to try to regulate the destructive ability of fortune. But if you wait too long, you're just going to be at its mercy. You won't be able to do anything. But you can plan and prepare in advance for fortune's destructive capabilities. But furthermore, you can actually control and subdue fortune. In other words, you can make your own luck, Machiavelli argues. You can actually like subdue and control fortune and circumstances to some extent. So you shouldn't just be passively reacting to fortune. You should act boldly and audaciously in the world to try to make your own luck. And to make this point, he uses another famous metaphor that's already been implicit here. And it's a very disturbing metaphor that he uses at the end of chapter 25. And it is a very gendered one, where he talks about fortune now directly as a lady. And again, it's a kind of disturbing, misogynistic, violent image that ends chapter 25. He says, I conclude then that since fortune changes and men stubbornly continue to behave in the same way, men flourish when their behavior suits the times and fail when they are out of step. I do think, however, that it is better to be headstrong than cautious. For if for fortune is a lady, it is necessary, if you want to master her, to beat and strike her. And one sees she more often submits to those who act boldly than to those who proceed in a calculating fashion. Moreover, since she is a lady, she smiles on the young, for they are less cautious, more ruthless, and overcome her with their boldness. So here we get the culmination of Machiavelli's kind of gendered and, in fact, quite misogynistic kind of battle between virtue and fortune here, where he makes this explicit that virtue is like the manly virtues of audacity and boldness and violence and bold action in the world. And he says, this is against the lady Fortune. Fortune is a lady who is wooed, he says, in very, again, kind of quite a kind of gendered and quite misogynistic theme. He says, the lady Fortune is wooed by being headstrong and um, and is wooed by being violent. In fact, he says, if you want to master her, to beat and strike her. And one sees she more often submits to those who act boldly than those who proceed in a calculating fashion. So here he's kind of saying the prince makes his own luck by acting boldly, acting ruthlessly, and in that way you kind of push Lady Fortune back and you subdue her, you woo her, you win her over, and you master and control her. And so we get in this final kind of metaphor this disturbing kind of culmination of a theme that we've been seeing throughout, where he's been valorizing the manliness of the prince and the manliness that is a part of virtuous action for him. And of course, as feminists, lots of feminist readings of Machiavelli and feminists in general have kind of taught us through their writings for many decades and centuries now. We understand that when there's a great valorization of masculinity and violence and tying of those things together, we tend to have a denigration of the feminine and a kind of pejorative view of the feminine and of the effeminacy. And that tends to culminate in pictures of and actions of not just gendered metaphors of violence, but actual kind of gendered violence, the control of men over women. And so you see that patriarchal, misogynistic kind of framework playing out here in Machiavelli in his gendered take on the struggle of the masculine prince against Lady Fortune. So that's the last of the themes of the text that I want to bring out. It's the kind of last main argument that comes out in chapter 25 before his kind of concluding chapter 26 of the text. Now, at this point, am I doing for time? Okay, so I've got some time left. I want to take stock a little bit of a number of things here by way of concluding our discussion of Machiavelli and tying back to some of our thinkers previously in the text. So I've been saying that our touchstone, our thematic kind of conversation that we are going to try to focus on across our different thinkers this term or this half of the course is the relationship between morality and politics. So now let me take some stock of what we've been looking at, what we've been reading to this point, and then bring Machiavelli into the conversation. Remember that for Socrates, how did Socrates imagine the relationship between morality and politics? Well, remember in the Apology, and of course, we're drawing a false distinction here where Socrates, we're talking about the Apology and Credo, and we're talking about Plato as the Republic, just to create a bit of a divide here between the arguments in either, and that the Apology is more about Socrates's philosophy, whereas the Republic is more about his own philosophy, even though Socrates continues to be a fictional character in the Republic. But in his trial, Socrates made an argument that if you want to lead the moral life, the life of the philosopher, pursuing justice, pursuing virtue, trying to get others to do the same, remember, Socrates argued that you should avoid politics, that politics is not the realm for the pursuit of morality, and that you won't be able to do that work that you want to do if you get involved in politics. You'll just be put to death, you'll be persecuted, or even you'll get corrupted. And so he argued we should keep morality and politics as separate as possible. So this is what I've represented here in this little diagram, very crude, roughly speaking, as Socrates arguing that, you should avoid politics if you want to live the moral life. So keep the moral life is kind of separate from the political life, and you should aim to separate those and live the moral life away from politics. But what did Plato and Aristotle add to this? Well, notice that Plato, in his ideal that he constructs, even though he concedes that with Socrates that, okay, well, most of the time, maybe, in existing circumstances, maybe it is good to avoid politics if you're trying to live the moral life and the life of philosophy and virtue and justice. But recall that Plato makes the argument, or the overarching argument, that ultimately what ought to be the case is that politics should actually be subsumed by the broader moral project, that that's actually the goal, and the ideal is for morality and the moral project or moral pursuit to actually define and organize all of politics. So this is why the philosopher king, who's the most moral among us, the people who are the least corruptible, they should be the ones with political power, because the ideal city should actually be helping all of us to be as moral as we can be, as our natures will allow. And in order for that to be the case, the politics has to be organized according to moral virtue. And those who have moral knowledge and insight. And so you get a sense here of, and the way I've represented it here is morality being the overarching project and politics being subsumed within it. And Aristotle, although the arguments are somewhat different, Aristotle also, and quite in contrast to Socrates, argues that, in fact, we are by nature political animals, and we should actually participate in politics because it helps to make us moral. It helps us to practice virtue, to learn how to exhibit good actions by engaging with others who are not out of necessity, but out of civic friendship, and learning how to think about others and to put others first and to put the whole ahead of the self. That happens through the practice of politics. And so we get to achieve our highest moral cultivation and achieve our natures that way through participating in politics. So even for Aristotle, morality is the overall concern, and politics is kind of a vehicle towards achieving our broader moral natures and moral development. So these are two ways of representing the relationship between morality and politics in the text that we've read before Machiavelli. Now let's bring Machiavelli into the picture. And I think how I would represent Machiavelli is something like the following. The argument Machiavelli makes is that from that kind of subsumed picture where politics is kind of part of a broader moral endeavor, and politics is subsumed under morality, the distinctive intervention of Machiavelli in his time was, and against the Christian tradition that came before that he's reacting to, and even the Greek and Roman traditions and many of their famous writers that came before. Machiavelli is his intervention was to say, no, we have to pull politics and morality apart somewhat. And there is a bit of overlap. Remember, Machiavelli kept saying to us, if you can be moral and be successful in politics, then do that. So he concedes that there is going to be overlap at times, and that's why the circles are both overlapping here. He says there is a space in the middle where you can be both, you can do what's politically necessary and do what's morally right. And you should do those things when they coincide. However, he says you must always be willing and to do what is necessary to be politically successful. And if that means leaving the moral behind, and in fact doing the opposite, be doing evil, he says you have to be willing at all times to do that. And so we see here that Machiavelli makes this argument that you have to pull politics and morality apart somewhat so that politics is treated as its own sphere of action that has its own ends and its own goals and its own principles, namely for power and glory. And you need to understand politics in its own right and be able to pursue what's necessary in politics away from considerations about what's moral. And so politics and morality are no longer subsumed. They're no longer coinciding with one another, with politics being part of a broader moral project. And now politics for Machiavelli has its own sphere. It's got its own goals and values and principles, and that needs to be taken separate from those of morality. John, you have a question?
Yes. Are these views on the separation of the goals of morality and politics in Machiavelli's view solely in the context of principalities, or do they also represent how he views politics in terms of republics as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a kind of a complicated question, but I think in general, what he is saying here is not just about the actions of a prince. He's even talking about, even if it would even apply to statesmen or people who are participating in the rule over their own people. I think he would argue that politics, whether it's just of the prince or a principality or even a republic, it is something that has its own kinds of ends, its own goals, and those are sometimes in conflict with the goals and ends of morality. If the goals and ends of morality are about, winning the favor of God and winning a good life in the afterlife and the rewards of the afterlife, sometimes I think Machiavelli would say you have to depart from those in order to achieve what is necessary and successful in political terms. And so I think it's a good question, but I think it goes beyond the principalities and is more about the political realm. and the need for order and stability and power in politics that sometimes require us to depart from moral considerations? That's a very good question. Okay, so that's we are out of time. So that wraps up. I'm kind of caught up here, thankfully. That wraps up our discussion of Machiavelli, and we are set up to have our discussion of Hobbes for the last two classes before the reading break. So I will stop sharing this, and Anna, I know you had a question, so let me. Anna, is your question related to something for the whole class? Should I keep recording? Will it be relevant to others, or should I stop recording at this point? Is it just a personal question for you?
No, the whole class is, yeah, it's
Okay.
fine if they know, because it's about the essay and the
Sure.
test coming up.
Yeah.
So for the essay, do we have to have a certain like citation style, a works cited? Can we use personal pronouns? Because I know it's an analysis thing too, but
Yeah.
I just want to make sure.
Yeah, good questions. Okay, so on the citation style, I've laid that out in the guidelines where I'm just asking for a very simple parenthetical citation where you cite both the page number of the textbook and the paragraph and line number from the margins of the text. So and actually that reminds me, I was supposed to come back to a question somebody had asked in an earlier class about the textbook, the ebook version of the textbook that you can access through the library. And in that version, you can see both in brackets, in like little square brackets or squiggly brackets, it labels both the page numbers of the hard copy of the textbook and it lays out the marginal line numbers and paragraph numbers in the within the text itself in the ebook. So if you're using the ebook, I went back and looked at it, and yes, you can see if you kind of go to say the first page of the apology, it says right before it says apology, the title, it says page 46 or something. Yeah, it says page 46 in squiggly brackets, and that's indicating that the page number of the textbook is page 46. And then it goes on to say in square brackets 17A or 17B or C. So you can use exclusively the textbook that's online in the ebook version and still have the same citations. You just need to watch out for those. Okay, so back to your question, Anna, you are just asked to use a simple parenthetical citation method within the text as I've laid out in the guidelines. And then in terms of a works cited, you can just, I mean, you're being asked just to use the course textbook, so you can provide a works cited with just like the textbook being cited there. If you do happen to bring in any other things, you need to, of course, include them. If you do, yeah, I'm asking you not to use other sources, but if you do go against that and use other sources, you do need to make sure to include them in a works cited. But otherwise, you would just be including the textbook, and the format for that doesn't really matter. It's just one book, obviously, as long as it's clear, that you're just laying out the basic details of our textbook. So you can consult with your TA about if they are more particular than I am about what style to use, but that's what I've said, is that the style doesn't particularly matter to me for the works cited, and for the citations, I would just like to see those basic in-text citation method.
Okay, and then
The
with
other part of your
regards
question.
to, yeah, the first person or something, because
Oh yeah.
it's supposed to be like an analysis,
Yeah.
and we're supposed to kind of talk about what we
Yeah.
thought, but I just
So
want to be sure.
in political theory papers, we tend to encourage people, and this is a good question, thank you for asking it. We tend to encourage people to write in their own voice and to take ownership of their own arguments, because your own, and the questions ask you to make your own analyses and arguments. And so you should not shy away at all from taking ownership and using first person and saying, I will argue, or my argument is, and you should not, that's actually considered a good, trait of a political theory paper to take ownership of your argument in that way. So you should not shy away at all from using, personal pronouns that way and to using the first person.
Okay, perfect. And
Okay.
then with regard to the exam on the 23rd,
Mhm.
will we at some point kind of know what to study, or is it kind of just like everything we've learned thus far?
It is going to be, I'm going to ask you to, study, like anything that we've covered is up for is fair game, but I will be sending out some guidelines by next week, for you to know what the exam will look like and to be able to prepare a bit more and to give you a bit more direction. So by next week you'll receive some guidelines on that so you can prepare and have a bit more of a sense of what it'll look like.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. John, you have a question?
Yes, this is a question I had earlier, but I'm still curious about it because I never got a response. Is
Sure.
about how Machiavelli held up Cesare Borgia as this example. Did that apply to any of the other politicians of the time, like Rodrigo Borgia or Catherine de' Medici or Caterina Sforza, that
Well,
also
I mean,
engaged in similar practices?
the text is your answer to that. You can he talks about lots of different people in this text. And you can, that's a matter of your own reading to go through the text and seeing who he holds up, who he decides to discuss and to I don't know, I can't remember myself all the people but he
Yeah.
goes through in all these chapters countless examples. What's clear is that Borgia is the person he holds up the most. But in terms of other figures, you'd have to just read through and see, if you're curious about any particular person, you can see whether he mentions them, and that would be the way of knowing about what he thinks about them. But in terms of specifics, I'm not sure that I can recall offhand whether he mentions any of the figures you are referring to.
Yeah,
But
the
anyway,
other
that can be your own
figures.
task to in your own reading of the text. Yeah.
I did see that he praised quite a few figures that didn't actually exist, like Romulus and Theseus.
So it's very interesting. He does kind of harken back to these kind of these figures who in terms of like how they are known and the stories that are told about them as being these great figures of virtue, of skill, who founded new territories and created a people out of nothing. These tend to be these stories from antiquity about all these older figures. And so yes, you're right that he does harken back, especially for the people he says are exemplars of great skill, great virtue. They tend to be these kind of very old, if not mythical figures. So that's a good observation. Yeah.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Yeah. Thank you. Take care, Shaya.
Right, I have just a quick question. So for when you're citing the line numbers, so say you have like 566A, is the line number one the exact line where they mention that, or is it the line underneath? If that
Well,
makes sense.
there's like the A, and then A kind of goes, it's kind of like 17A until B starts, and then it's 17B. So all the lines under the A are after the A are all part of like 17A until it gets to 17B. So it's everything after the label.
Okay, so line 1 starts after that label then.
Yeah, and you don't need to worry about like because they don't number them by line specifically. It's just kind of A, B, and so it's more paragraphs. So you can use just like the A or B. You don't have to go beyond that to the actual line number beyond that. So it's like the numbering system um uh will have a number, and then for each number it'll be A, B, C, D. So you can just use 17A as the paragraph number and leave it at that.
Oh, okay. Just because in our tutorial, I've seen ones where we had to use the specific line numbers. So if it's
Okay.
just fine using the A, B, or whatever, then
That's fine for me. If your TA says differently, if they're asking, then just pay attention to what they're saying and what they're asking for you to do, because they're the ones who are going to be grading it. And so if they want more specific, very specific line numbers, then you just have to count the line number beyond. So I'm looking at. I just opened the page to book 9 of the Republic. There's like 574A, and then, it goes to 574B in about 20 lines later. So if you have to count the line after 574A and 574A line 4, then, that's not that much more work to do. You just have to count the line number.
yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, don't see anything else, so take care, folks. We'll see you next week.